Hello, and welcome to this brief, but I hope comprehensive and helpful tutorial on writing a literary analysis. Analyzing literature is not that difficult, but you have to first understand what its purpose is and how to go about doing it. To perform an analysis is essentially like dissecting a frog or a person. You're using a very fine tool, in this case your mind, in order to cut away what's not necessary and reveal the essence of what it is you're trying to discover and understand. As I've said, analyzing literature is very much the kind of activity that has analogies to a biology lab. So here we see a full woman, but we also see beneath the full woman all the various systems and organs that allow her to function. A work of literature has the same kind of makeup. It is a whole experience, something that you read from beginning to end. But in order for it to have the kind of value or effect it does on the reader, there are a variety of themes, techniques, characteristics that work together, just as the various systems of the body work together, in order to produce this living and vibrant work of art. So, when we want to understand how a person works, we dissect the person and examine the various organs and systems. And when we want to understand how a work of literature works, we do the same thing. The first step is to separate the part from the whole. This is, I believe, the hardest strategy for a young writer to do. Most of the time, this kind of dissection has been performed for the student by a professor or by a teacher. But when you reach the sophomore level, and certainly beyond, this kind of dissection has to be performed by the person who is, in the end, writing the essay, that is, analyzing the work. Once you have identified the part of the work of literature that you are going to analyze, once you have isolated that from the whole so that you can focus your attention not necessarily only on that element, but especially on that element in a way that illuminates the whole, the next step is to see how that particular part, that element, how it functions within the whole of the work of literature. Next, you have to explain the function. That's where the essay comes in. The essay is an explanation. It's, in many respects, a kind of written version of what a teacher does in the classroom. A teacher tries to show how something works to a student. And in writing a paper, you are essentially teaching someone who doesn't understand this particular element of the work in question. You're trying to explain or teach to that person how it does work. And finally, you will need to demonstrate that function that you've discovered and that you can explain in the essay format. So what we'll cover today, or at least in this particular presentation, are the first 3 steps, and I believe that I have a fairly easy way to demonstrate how this works. And I'll be using the assignment that you have for the first module, the one on the Dream of the Rood. So the analysis, the method, that's what we're going to focus on. And as I've subtitled it here, and please think of it in this fashion. It's reading with a scalpel. It's not simply reading from the top of the head all the way down to the feet. It's using the the fineness of one's mind to be able to go into the body of the work and understand it at least in one detail. Understand the details in one particular way. The first step is to read the assignment carefully. So this is the assignment. I'll read it out loud. The Anglo-Saxon period in English saw the gradual conversion of the Germanic pagan culture to Christianity. As you have learned firsthand from reading Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxons valued those characteristics that embodied a warrior ethos. Particular moments of the epic illustrate these characteristics. The warrior's vow to serve his thane, the necessity of fulfilling one's vow, skill in battle, achieving immortality through fame. There are, of course, others. Write a 2-page minimum paper in which you analyze how the depiction of the crucifixion in the Dream of the Rood uses characteristics of the warrior ethos to transform Christ into a uniquely Anglo-Saxon hero. Your paper must be in MLA style and adhere to the formal conventions of academic writing in general and literary analysis in particular. So the first step in separating the part from the whole is understanding what it is you're trying to separate. So, based upon the assignment, the question that you have to ask yourself is, what are the characteristics of the warrior ethos? Since you're trying to show Beowulf as a representative, you're trying to show Christ as a representative of this. So, the first place you should look to see if you can determine more about what your subject is the question itself. And, in fact, some of these warrior virtues are mentioned in the question. Here I've highlighted some obvious clues to indicate that we're dealing with some of these values. Warrior's vow, for example, or fulfilling one's vow, battle, fame, immortality through fame. These are possible characteristics that you should keep in mind, probably by having written down, when you go back and reread the poem. If the subject matter of the poem that you've been assigned, such as in this case, is in a textbook, then you should look through the scholarly material in the textbook to see if you can find any clues as well. Usually a textbook will provide historical and cultural background for the work in question. And you can find this introduction, you can find this in the introduction to different units or chapters or sections. And you can also find this information in the introductions to individual works and to individual authors. So here is an excerpt from the Norton Anthology's introduction to Anglo-Saxon literature. And as you can see, and reading through it, I came across a number of terms that obviously would be important to constructing my analysis. I mean, some of this material is not helpful. For example, the tribe is ruled by a chieftain who is called king, a word that has kin for its root. The Lord, a word derived from Old English, halaf, loaf, plus werd, protector, right? That's not that important. However, what follows that, surrounds himself with a band of retainers. That might be important. Members of the household, maybe not. But what I did in this situation was to look for the word heroic. And we have German heroic poetry, so I know that this section, this paragraph here, and the following paragraph, obviously, contains some of the information that I'm looking for. So we have heroic poetry, characteristics, heroic world, heroic behavior. All of these words indicate that these two paragraphs within the introductory material contain important information regarding what it is that you've been assigned to write. So by reading through this, you should be able to ascertain some of the key characteristics that you are being asked to identify and to make use of in your analysis. I'm going to take a moment to add an important note here. As you're going through and looking for information to assist you in identifying those characteristics that the assignment has asked you to write about, you are going to need to make sure that you write down any page numbers from which you take this information. In this case, of course, it'll be the textbook. That's the example I'm using here. But any source, regardless of what it is, any source that gives you information that you use, you have to indicate where you got that from. You are obliged, not just because it's the thing to do in a literature class, but you are morally obliged to indicate who and where, from whom and where you got this information. To take something that someone has made, and therefore someone owns, and use it for your own satisfaction, and not give credit to the person who made it, is stealing. And that's what I mean when I say it's immoral. I know that we live now in a society where so much is available at one's fingertips that it becomes very easy to think of anything you find on the internet, anything you find in a book, as free for you to use, simply because, especially on the internet, you don't have to pay to access it. But this is not true. So, even if you paraphrase, which means, of course, to put something into your own words, the information, you are still obliged or obligated, as the word I've used here says, you are still obligated to indicate where it came from. So please, as you are taking notes, and you will need to take notes, you will not succeed in any kind of literary analysis and essay writing at the upper levels of college if you do not take notes. When you're taking notes, indicate your source and your page number. It doesn't have to be the full bibliographical information. You can go back and get that later, but you need to have enough information so that you know what to put in your paper. Now, when you've identified the characteristics that you are looking for, and so that you can analyze, the next question, of course, is where are the characteristics in the poem? Well, you're going to need to read through the poem carefully and look for those words or those actions that in some way convey the values, the characteristics that you are looking for. The easiest way to do this is to separate the parts of the poem's text that have nothing to do with the characteristics from those that express the characteristics. Not everything in the poem is going to be useful. In fact, most of the material in any work of literature is going to be utterly useless to you. Those of you that simply like to read until you find something that you think will work and throw it into a paper, just to prove that you've read the poem or the work of literature, you are not going to pass an assignment by approaching it from that perspective. So you need to make sure that you are going through and finding only what's going to be useful for you. Now, here is the opening of the Dream of the Rood. And the Dream of the Rood, which is not uncommon, this is not uncommon for medieval literature. It's a genre called a dream vision. And so you often begin with a narrator who is talking to you, the audience, using first person, and then segueing into a second narrative or a second level of narration in which the dream is related. And in this case, we have three levels. We have the first level, which is the dreamer of the dream who introduces you to his dream. The second level is the dream in which the Rood speaks, and then the third level is the story of Christ's crucifixion, which is the story that the Rood tells. So there are three levels. It's very sophisticated writing in many respects, and the kind of writing that we are not going to see used very frequently until we get to the 20th century. Nevertheless, none of that has anything to do with what your assignment is. And I can say the same thing about the opening of the Dream of the Rood. You can read through here, you can look at everything, it's none of this. Even though there is a lot of material that I might point out when I teach this, say things like the gemstones gleamed, and point out that the way the Rood is described, it looks like the cover, the ornate cover of a medieval copy of the Gospels, something along the lines of the Book of Kells, for example. However, that has nothing to do with a depiction of the Rood itself. The Rood actually doesn't appear except in the most general way. So this whole section, and many more like it in the poem, will be of no use to you whatsoever. But what's helpful here is for you to be able to identify, well, I don't need to worry about that, I need to go on. It's going to create, I hope, in you a sense of liberation and freedom when you can set aside entire passages of a work and tell yourself, I don't have to worry about this. This is not what I'm writing about. It makes your task feel a lot less overwhelming. Now, here I've identified a section, and there are other sections. This is not the only possible source of information on the characteristics that you are being asked to analyze. But this is one that I selected, and so here we have it. I've highlighted, which if you have the e version, the the electronic version of the textbook, you can do the same thing. If you don't, you might need to use a pencil. If you don't want to mark up your textbook for whatever reason, I do recommend at least making, with something small like this, making some copies. That way you'll have a text that you can write on, underline, make notes on. That's very well. It used to be very common. I certainly did that a lot when I was in grad school and when I was in undergrad. Anyway, look, the words that I identified, Lord, foes, coming with great haste, that just seemed like it seemed heroic to me. I did not dare act against the Lord's word. That sounds also like it falls in. Strong and courageous, that definitely seems to figure in. Climbed up on the high gallows. I didn't include the gallows there. Brave in the sight of many. Brave seems very important. And mighty king. I raised up a mighty king. All of these are descriptors, either of actions or of simply commentary that the root is making about Christ. These are all descriptors that make me feel like Christ is being presented as a hero. Now, you can't just leave it at that. You have got to go a little bit, or in some cases, a lot, beyond. But this is a very good start. Now, the next step to make your job as easy as possible is to organize the characteristics. You don't have to worry about labeling them or anything like that. You just need to organize them, putting them into groups identifying which characteristics belong with other characteristics, and keeping them separate from characteristics that don't seem to have anything in common with them. In other words, make yourself a set of characteristics, or a few sets of characteristics. So here are the characteristics without the rest of the text. This is the ultimate use of the mental scalpel. This is what I want to focus on. This material here is what I need. The rest of it, even the material that appears in proximity to this, is not necessary for me. So, what should I do with this? Well, what I've done here is I've taken them and put them into different groupings. So, coming with great haste and climbed up on the high rood. I should have included the rood there. Those are actions, so I put them into a group of actions. Strong and courageous, brave in the sight of many. These are the kinds of adjectives that we expect to hear from, or to hear about, that we expect to hear describing a hero. So I put them into a group. Lord, King, Lord. These are all words that suggest kingship, which is a very important element of Anglo-Saxon culture. And then finally I have foes. I know that a great warrior, has to fight foes. So the word is important, but it doesn't really belong with any of the other pieces of potential evidence that I've identified. So I've left it off in its own circle. It may be that I wind up in a potential paper that I'm writing. I may not use it. It may be that if I go through and read more, read the poem over a few more times, with foes in mind, I may come across other instances of examples that would fit into that little circle there. But if I don't find any others, then I'm not going to use it, because one piece of evidence is not evidence. You have to have multiple pieces for there to be a for there to be enough support for your inference to convince someone who's reading the paper. And simply one example is not going to be enough. Now then, we have to explain the function. And the first step is to make an inference. Now, this is something that you probably have not been taught, so I'm going to give you an explanation about that now. An inference is a conclusion you reach by applying logic to the evidence you are given. Now then, to make inferences from reading material, you will need to take two or more details from the reading and see if you can draw a conclusion. Now remember, making an inference is not just making a guess, even though the answer is not stated in the reading passage. You need to make a judgment that can be supported, just as you could reasonably infer there is a baby in a stroller, because even though you do not know for certain, it is the most likely possibility. Okay, what all of that means is that in everyday situations, we are constantly making inferences. We read a situation, we see what evidence is presented to our eyes or our ears, and even though what is going on, the state of affairs, might not be immediately apparent, judging by what you can see and what you can hear, smell, etc., you might be able to determine what's going on. For example, if you step outside and you hear sirens and you smell smoke, you may not see a house on fire, but you can infer that there is one. If you let's say you have a friend that went out on a date and a roommate, and he came back from that date early, so that's one piece of information. He was crying, and he went straight to his room. Now, you don't know what happened on that date because you weren't there. So you don't have the evidence of the actions and the words that were passed. However, there are enough pieces of information in that scenario for you to make an inference. And the inference is they broke up. That would be the logical thing to assume. So when you are reading a work of literature, or when you're looking at a painting or a work of visual art, or when you're even reading a work of nonfiction, a historical work, you instinctively make these inferences. You make them all the time. All you're being asked to do when you write a paper is to explain those inferences. So you need to ask yourself, what do these details seem to show? Is there enough evidence to support my inference? Are there any other possible ways to interpret this? So, are there other possible interpretations of smoke and sirens? Yeah, I suppose so. Someone might be barbecuing and there is an accident, and those are police cars going to the accident. That's a possibility. I hear that around my house all the time. Smell that as well. Your friend, perhaps he, perhaps what happened on the date was that, and I'm trying to come up with something reasonable, not something ridiculous, but perhaps um, your friend's date um, got sick in the middle of dinner and decided to go home, and then on the way back from uh, from the restaurant, your friend may have, I don't know, this is going to sound terrible, hit a dog and killed it, and he's very upset and feels bad, feels very guilty. That's a possibility, okay? But that's not probably what you would immediately infer. You would infer that the early arrival, the crying, and the sequestering of himself in his room, you would infer that those all go together, and it probably means she broke up with him. So there are some general inferences we can make based upon these groups here, right? So we've got king or a lord, and obviously things like Lord and Mighty King and Lord's Word. By the way, notice the translator capitalizes Lord's Word, meaning that he interprets the word that was used in that instance to be a reference to God, but king is not, nor is Lord, so there's a possibility that the Anglo-Saxon words used there were meant to refer to someone like a secular king, an Anglo-Saxon king. Now, you'd have to know Old English in order to be able to make that determination, and none of you do. I do, but it's been a very long time since I studied it. So, although I translated the Dream of the Rood, I don't remember all of those words, obviously. Heroic action, that's the way I see the coming with great haste and climbed up on the high cross, I believe was the word after that. It's as though Christ were embracing his fate, as though he were rushing into battle. So that's how I interpret those. That's the inference I make. Bravery is a necessary quality for an Anglo-Saxon warrior, an Anglo-Saxon hero, and here Christ is strong and courageous, and he's brave in the sight of many. That's also important because he's developing fame as well. But that's a different thing. So we want to keep our evidence, at least in this regard, focused on our inferences there. And of course, foes, war or warlord. Can some of these work together to support a topic sentence in a paragraph? Yes, they could. They could. I'm not going to do that here, but they could. But you want to be very careful, okay? And you don't want to keep using the same evidence to support different inferences. At a certain point, it's just not going to sound logical. So, a more formal inference would work as the topic sentence of a body paragraph in this essay. So, the formal inference that I've taken from one of my little circles there is the poem describes him as an Anglo-Saxon king or lord. Well, that corresponds to the heroic ethos of the Anglo-Saxons. So what evidence do I have? Well, he is given traditional titles, Lord and Mighty King. And then in addition, the Rood describes his relationship with Christ as like the relationship between a king and his thane. Now, that is a fairly sophisticated inference, and the only thing I have as evidence at this juncture is I did not dare act against the Lord's word. Okay. Now, that's going to require some kind of explanation. You can't just set that there and expect the reader to draw that conclusion. So, in some instances, the evidence requires an explanation. So the explanation I have here is the rood owes Christ loyalty, did not dare act against the Lord's word, just as the thane owes his king or liege loyalty. Well, so obedience then. Well, that seems to make Christ into a kind of a person of authority within a hierarchy. So it would make him be the Lord, like Beowulf, right? Or in the early part of Beowulf, Hrothgar, with Beowulf pledging loyalty to him as a thane. So within this paragraph, then, I have an overall inference. Describes him as an Anglo-Saxon king or lord. Then I have two minor inferences, traditional titles, and I need that because just to say Lord and Mighty King is not sufficient to get me from the evidence to the major inference of the paragraph, the topic sentence. So I need to have an intermediary inference. He is given traditional titles, such as Lord and Mighty King. There we go. Then with the second lesser inference, the rood describes his relationship with Christ as like the relationship between a king and his thane. That supports the description of Christ as an Anglo-Saxon king or lord, but again, needs further explanation for us to get to the analogy being made in that second lesser inference. So that requires the explanation. How are we supposed to understand this piece of evidence? Well, we're supposed to understand it as the loyalty that a thane owes to his liege or king. So, that's it. It's not that difficult, but it does require very thorough thinking, and it does require staying focused on the small details and drawing inferences out of them. Our next step, we put things together. Now, some of you may be at, we are at the point now where some of you might just start scribbling. But that is not how you should approach this. Before you even begin to write, you need to put together an outline. It is absolutely essential because only the outline is going to tell you if you have everything you need, if you have it where it belongs, and well, that's really it. Do you have everything you need, and do you have it where it belongs? So what I recommend, and in the case of, well, what I recommend is that you produce an outline. Notice it is a preliminary outline, or what we call, generally speaking, a working outline, because it is there to organize your initial thinking, your initial analysis, but since it's not formed into a paragraph, you have the opportunity of making changes as necessary. And it's always necessary to make changes. You will find things in the course of working on your next two paragraphs, your your second and third inferences to support the thesis, which of course is your biggest, majorist, which is not a word, I know, inference. You will come across things that might fit better in this particular paragraph. So you don't want to write the paragraph yet because there'll be no place to put anything. If you organize your thoughts and evidence into into a working outline where you really only make reference to the essence of your evidence and your inferences, then then you can move them around, you can remove and add, you can do all kinds of things. So here is a diagram of preliminary outline. Obviously, the thesis is the poet of the Dream of the Rood transforms Christ into an Anglo-Saxon warrior hero through the use of description, action, and characterization. That's what I've decided I was going to say in the paper. This is what I've taken away from it. So the description would be the first paragraph, and that's what we have in the first topic sentence. So Christ is described as a warlord. So that is Roman numeral 1 in my working outline. That's going to be followed by my first supporting piece of information, which is going to be an inference based on evidence. He is given traditional titles of a warlord. So now I would need to see those titles. So Lord is one, and Mighty King is another. The parentheses there indicate where you would need to place the line number, so that way you can make sure to have that at hand for when you write your essay. The next minor inference, so to speak, is the B section of the working outline. So the Rood describes his relationship with Christ as like the relationship between a king and his thane. The evidence, of course, is I did not dare act against the Lord's word. And then after that, the explanation, the Rood owes Christ loyalty, just as the thane owes his king or liege loyalty. All of these, as you can see with the arrows, create a chain of support all the way up to the thesis. That is the way an essay in general, and a literary analysis in particular, is created. Still to come, not in this presentation, but in subsequent presentations, we will cover introductions and conclusions. Then we will talk about integrating sources, how to use and deploy is a good word for that, quotations and paraphrasing. And then finally, MLA formatting, where we talk about the use of parenthetical citations, a works cited page if necessary, and of course the general shape and look of a proper paper in an English literature class. I hope this has demystified the process of writing a literary analysis for you, and I hope it has given you the tools necessary that you will be able to approach the process of writing one of these with confidence and bravery, very much like an Anglo-Saxon hero.